Hello, this is the Provoked Prawn, and this is the NZXT Kraken Elite 280 RGB. And in this video, I'm going to show you the setup process for it, show off some GIFs and other funky things that you can do at the end in the software. I'm going to show you the considerations that you need with mounting and the logic of that and the things to avoid, like making it so that it's a bit too close to your graphics card, for example, and covering off the software as well later on. And I'm going to show you both the installation for AMD's AM5 and Intel's LGA 1700 socket as well. So lots of things to cover, and I'm going to go into a lot of depth on all the different things you need to know. So hopefully it'll be really helpful, and if it is, let me know in the comments. So I want to talk to you about all the different things and the logic of the installation, because once you get everything out of the box, it might look a bit intimidating, but don't worry, because actually it's a fairly straightforward setup with some really nice things about it. This cooler comes with Intel's bracket pre-installed on the pump head, more on that in a minute, but it does have AMD bracketing as well, and it's fairly straightforward to swap between those with relative ease, and it will work with a variety of different motherboards. So you can see that you have included things for AM4, for example, so if you're on an older motherboard, there's no need to worry. It will work with those too, as well as other things, and I'll leave all the specs in the description so you can find out more. But I wanted to show the steps for each of these just to make things a bit more straightforward. You'll see that you have standoffs, but you also have loads of screws, and there's enough screws in there for a push-pull setup, which means fans on both sides, and I will show that as well. And once you've got everything out, you can see there's a lot of different things going on here. We've got some nice new core fans with RGB lighting on the fans themselves, and obviously this is a 280mm version, so you got some nice large fans. You also have pre-installed thermal paste. So there's thermal paste already on there. You don't need to worry about getting your own, but do take care. Obviously you've got this plastic cover on there, which is protecting that, so don't remove that until you need to, so that will be protected and it will stay like that, because even a slight smudge on that can make quite a difference to the thermal cooling performance, so it's worth bearing in mind. You'll also notice there's a warning on there to ensure that all the cables are connected beforehand, especially the SATA power, and that's because there's a connector directly on the pump head, which has a breakout cable with loads of different connections on it, but it needs to be powered. So this thing is self-contained. It already has liquid inside it, but it also basically everything that connects to it is all controlled by the pump head and by your motherboard, and it's all sort of set up in a logical way that works really well, and it's fairly straightforward to set up. First thing to think about is the logic of how you're going to install the radiator. Now I'm building it in the NZXT H7 Flow RGB, which it takes up to a 360mm radiator on top. I initially was going to use this there, but this is a 280, so it wouldn't quite be aesthetically pleasing. And I also realized I wanted to do push-pull setup, so more on that in a little while, because you have those extra fans so that you can do that if you want to. But for a standard installation, if you've got a case that would suit it, I recommend installing it on the top of the case and then installing your fans like this. So essentially what that does is it faces the fans in towards the case, because where the NZXT logo is where the air is being pulled from. So it'll be pulled through the fans, through the radiator, and pushed out at the top, and that will then cool the liquid inside. I've actually tried various different positions for coolers, and I found that this is a pretty decent setup. Works quite well. Top mount it. Install the fans this way, make sure the cables are facing towards the back so you can hide those away, and you're good to go. But as I said, it does come with extra screws included, so you can do push-pull, and more on that in a little bit. Next thing that you'll find, which actually looks fairly intimidating, is this cable, which has loads of connections on it. This plugs into the pump head, and then it has multiple different connections for SATA power, which will be from the power supply unit. It also has the fan power connection, so you connect your fans directly up to the pump head. It has a connector that has to go to the motherboard and more, so there's lots of different things. But don't worry, because I'm going to show you each of the steps, where they connect, and show you the logic for it as well as we go through, to make things a little bit easier and more straightforward, and hopefully hassle-free. But it is important that you connect this, and it's really important that you connect up the SATA power connector and this USB cable. So the USB cable connects to the bottom of your motherboard, and I'll show you that later on. But you need to do that in order to be able to control the pump head. So to get those GIFs, for example, that I showed at the beginning, you need to make sure you've got that installed in the motherboard, because that gives you control via NZXT Cam software, which I'll show you later on what to do in that and how you can change things. And then you see that you have the SATA power connector plus this fan power cable, which is split into 3 parts. Now the fans included come with 2 cables. you've got a fan power connections, which you can see here, and then you've got the RGB connector. The fan power connector connects up to that breakout cable on the pump head. Obviously, with a 280mm, you only have 2 connections, so that's worth bearing in mind, but you've got 4 cables because you've got 2 RGB and 2 fan power connectors. You can see they're quite a bit different. So the RGB one on the left-hand side here has a little clip on top of it, so you can't mix these up. You won't get it wrong with the installation. You also have this little control box included, and that's for the RGB lighting only. So you plug the RGB into there. There's 3 connectors on it, but you'll only be using 2 with a 280mm. Essentially, this is the same for the 360mm setup, but you then have an extra fan that you'd be plugging in, and that controller controls the RGB lighting, whereas the pump itself controls the power. So for an easier view of this, now I'm showing a lot of this outside the case just to make it easier for you to see the logic of it, but you would actually obviously install everything once it's connected up and ready to go into your case. So you wouldn't necessarily connect up all the wires now, but I want to give you some views of this. You can see, for example, this breakout cable. One of those connectors has 4 pins in it, the other ones only have 2. Point of note there, just pay attention to that. But you plug in your fans into those connectors. So I'd start with the one that has 4 pins in and then plug your other fan into the 3-pin connector. Again, you've got 3 connections here. For the 280mm, you'll only be using 2, but if you had the 360mm version of this, you'd be using all 3. And I'm actually going to use more than that because I'm going to be doing fans on both sides of the radiator. More on that later on, I'll show you what I mean there. But this ensures that the fans are powered and controlled by the system itself. So all-in-one connection not only contains all the coolant you need to keep the system cool, but also it just controls everything in a logical way. So you can see the fans are connected, for example, to that pump head, and then I was obviously powering them as well. So for a zoomed out view of that, once again, just to make life straightforward, you wouldn't plug these in until the end because that RGB controller is likely going to sit at the back of your case. It certainly did in mine, but you can see 2 RGB connections, 1 from each fan, and then 2 fan power connections, 1 from each fan connects up to the pump head. And that's that basic logic. But then you've got to connect things up to your motherboard and to your system power as well. So I'll show you each step of that as we go through. A very important one of these is the SATA power connector, which is a flat connection that connects up to the power supply unit. In this case, the Corsair RM1000E. You should have those cables included with your power supply, and that runs from the pump head to the PSU, and that gives it power. This is very important because it powers both the pump head and the fans. You can see that you've got to make sure there's a label on there that says you've got to connect that SATA power before you turn the PC on, otherwise it won't be cooled properly. The next is a small little cable which connects up either to the CPU fan or all-in-one pump header on your motherboard. It's going to vary from motherboard to motherboard, but you can see the Gigabyte one has a CPU fan header. This Asus motherboard has an AIO pump. There's also system fan pumps on the Gigabyte one as an option. You'd opt for one of those, generally AIO pump, but CPU fan is a standard if you don't have a pump header. Now the RGB controller needs to be connected up to the USB header on your motherboard, as does the pump as well. There is a splitter cable included in the box, or Y splitter, so you can connect up both into a single port, which is worth bearing in mind. Then that controller needs SATA power as well, so make sure that's plugged into PSU too. Now I'm going to start with the LGA 1700 socket installation process. This is a Gigabyte motherboard, essentially 13th gen CPU, and the setup process for this is pretty easy because it already comes with the bracket included on the pump head, so that's an Intel bracket. You just need to mount the back plate on the rear of the motherboard. Now this is adjustable, so you want to push the pins out to the far corners of each of the corners of this, and then that will fit with a 1700 socket. The standoffs then push through to the other side, and you can see them through the 4 corners here surrounding the CPU. You then have the Intel 1700 standoffs clearly marked on a little bag included in the box, and you can see what these look like here, and you just then screw those down into this back plate that we've put into the rear. Obviously you need to make sure all 4 are installed and nice and tight during this process. Now this is quite similar to other Intel setups as well, so if you're doing another Intel setup, you'll find obviously the relevant standoffs included, and there's details in the manual on how to do it, but the logic is basically the same. You need a back plate, you need to install the standoffs, and then you put the pump head down on top of that. So I'm showing this once again outside the case, so it's easy to see. Obviously we're not at the end of the build yet, I will show that as well, but this is how it would work. So you'd sit that pump head down over the top, then you use the thumb screws that are included in that little bag. you basically put the pump down, remembering to remove the plastic cover beforehand, seat it down in there, and then use those thumb screws to hold it down in place. And then obviously make sure you connect up all the cables and everything else as well. So that's the Intel setup. Now for AMD's AM5, which is ever so slightly different. So the AM5 motherboard has pre-installed sort of standoffs on it. You can see there's some plastic brackets around the top and bottom of the socket on this motherboard. And so those need to be removed first. So you essentially have 4 screws that need to be taken out so those plastic clips can be taken off. You'll notice as well that we also have a bracket in the top left here, which is going to be needed to install on the pump head, and removing the Intel bracket. So basically it will socket in quite nicely. Now you have these little plastic caps, and they are different for AM4 and AM5 depending on which way around you're doing it. So with AM5 you need to make sure that they're seated down this way, which is with the threaded bit, so the bit that has those markings sits at the top. So you can see that the markings on there will sit at the top. If you're doing AM4, it's actually the other way around with those bits at the bottom. But essentially these sit over the standoffs as they are from the standard backplates. There's already a backplate installed on this, you don't need to use that. And then you'll see that you have these standoff screws, which actually have different lengths to them. So you want to use the longer bit to go through the plastic housing that we've just put in there and screw that into the backplate on the motherboard, and make sure those are nice and tight and not loose as well. You might notice a little bit of wobble in there even when they're pre-installed, but once you've seated down the pump head and the thumb screws, it should all be nice and tight. But it is important to make sure that this is all connected up nicely, because if it is too loose, then obviously the pump head won't sit properly on the CPU, and then you won't get the cooling that you need from it as well. So quite similar, the Intel build versus the AMD build. Fairly straightforward setup. Again, pre-installed thermal paste, so you don't need to worry about that, but you do need to take the bracket off. So this is the Intel bracket that's pre-installed. You just basically twist it. It twists and turns and then comes off. And then the AMD one will just flick back on. So you can see it's got some notches on it. You just need to line those notches up and then click it back into place. And then you're just going to seat that down over the top once the CPU's installed and it's already installed in the case as well. And then the thumb screws just go down on top of the standoff screws in each of the 4 corners, and it's secured nicely in there and nice and tight to make sure everything works. Take care to install those very carefully, not to over tighten, but those thumb screws do make a difference. Now, as I said, I'm using the NZXT H7 RGB in this build, so this is a flow variant, and it has 140mm fans on the front. And those are the same fans as the ones we're using on this radiator. So I thought, for demo purposes, I can show that you can do this if you want to. We're going to use the 2 fans on the top of here, and essentially we're going to do a push-pull setup. Now, you don't need to do this, but I wanted to demonstrate it is possible to go through the logic of certain things and how you would do them. So these fans are already connected up to the back of the case, and I've removed them from the fan tray, and then what I'm going to do is use the extra long radiator screws that are included to run those through the fans, through that fan tray and into the radiator. What we're doing now is I'm swapping the fans around, because you see I pre-installed the fans so that they were in exhaust position because I was going to mount it on top, but now I'm going to do intake instead. So now I'm swapping the fan direction around so that they'll be pulling air through the radiator. So the idea here is the fans on the inside of the case will be pulling, and then the fans on the outside of the case will be sucking air from the front and pushing it through the radiator. So both lots of fans are then supporting each other in terms of the airflow through, and in theory it should improve that airflow as well. Now this case obviously has 3 fans pre-installed on it. I'm only going to be using 2 on the radiator, and then I'm going to leave 1 at the bottom, which is basically just going to blow into where the power supply unit would be and where the hard disk drives might mount if you had some installed there as well. So this is just something you can do if you want to. You could also use a 360mm radiator in this logic, or mount a 360mm version on the top instead. But I'm just showing the logic of what you do here. Now, I did have a little bit of a struggle here with the setup of this because of the way the radiator mounts. So I found that I had to install the bracket for this cooler and essentially install that first and then push the radiator onto it. If you try and mount the radiator at the top of this bracket and then put it back in, you'll find it doesn't work because the radiator sits a little bit high. You can see from this side-on view, for example, at the very top of the rad, sits a little bit high. just above where the bracket actually sits. So it's actually very difficult to get back in. But what you can do is you can basically just screw through the front, as I said. So we're going to use the long screws from the radiator to pass through the fans, through the fan tray, and then into the radiator as well. So you've got fans on both sides, both facing the same direction. So make sure they're facing the right way, because essentially we've got these fans here that are now in the front. They're going to be pulling cold air from the front of the case, pushing it through the radiator, and then being sucked out the other side to give superior cooling. Now, a note about the placement, you'll see that the tubes are at the bottom. This is what a lot of people will tell you to do, and that's because they've seen a Gamer's Nexus video on the installation of it and how you should do it. But actually the takeaway there is actually incorrect, because what you're meant to do is make sure that the CPU pump head is not the highest point in the build. But I actually wanted to do it this way around to demonstrate why it can cause some problems. So more on that in a second. But here you can see, obviously I've got a lot of cables to deal with now. So instead of having 2 RGBs and 2 fan powers, I've now got more, because obviously I've got the front cables as well. So now we're ending up with more RGB controllers, because you need 2 just to manage all those fans for the push-pull setup. And then obviously you've also got the fan power connectors as well. So what I'm now using is a splitter cable. So I've got another splitter cable which connects up 3 fan power cables into a single one. And then I'm going to connect that up to the pump head, so that you'll have the power for 4 fans all being connected and controlled by that pump head. So now we're further into the build. Obviously the radiator's mounted. You're going to put the pump down on top of the CPU gently and carefully, and then use the thumb screws to secure it in place. Now, you may need to make sure that these are tight, but don't over tighten them. So careful, but also go corner to corner. So I did the top right corner, and then the bottom left corner, and then the top left corner, and then the bottom right corner, and basically secure these down in that way. And also just go around and make sure each of them is tight. You can see I'm using a screwdriver, but also being very gentle with it. But if it's not tight enough, it won't cool your CPU well. And if it's too tight, you might damage the pins on the motherboard. So you need to be quite careful with the sort of pressure of that. And then we have that breakout cable. So all important. Everything is mostly connected now, but we need to make sure we run this through to the back of the case and connect up those things. So the important ones, obviously that CPU fan cable, connect that up to the top of the motherboard. You can see on this board, I can't actually reach the pump header, which is at the bottom, because that cable is not quite long enough. So you just plug it into the CPU fan header instead. But if you have all in one pump header, you can use that as an option. And then we need to run those other breakout cables to the back. So if you're doing a standard installation without push-pull, don't forget just 2 fans connect up to that breakout cable. But in my case, I'm going to be connecting up 4. A lot of cables to deal with. And because of the number of RGB fans, there's also a lot of other things. So obviously I've got multiple NZXT RGB hubs on here, and I also have a USB connection from the pump head as well. So now I'm going to use Corsair's internal 4-port USB hub. So this is a USB hub that will allow you to split 4 different connections and then connect up a single connector to your motherboard. I'd actually recommend just using this for the RGB controls if you're doing something similar to me, and then connect the pump head directly to the motherboard on its own. I found that is the best setup, and will make sure that everything runs smoothly and as to be expected. All of these things are actually magnetic as well though, so they do just attach to the case really easily. But now obviously we've got a lot of controllers and a lot of RGB controllers that require SATA power, and a lot of USB headers that need to run to your motherboard. The USB is really important if you want to control all these things through CAM software as well. So if you want to control the RGB lighting and the display, you need to make sure those are all connected, but also that you've got enough SATA power connectors. So that flat daisy chainable power from these various things needs to be plugged in individually, and each of these requires power. So you need to make sure you've got enough connectors connected up to your power supply unit. You might well find that you need 2 of those SATA power connectors. And then we're at the stage where it's all done, basically. Just turn it on, and you can see, as standard, it actually defaults to white. So you need to download NZXT's Cam software, and then you can customize the lighting in there. Don't forget to obviously peel that little sticker off as well. Now I wanted to talk about the logic of mounting the radiator. So as I said earlier on, I'd actually go for top mounting the radiator in preference to what I've done. just because it will give you more space and it actually gives better airflow in my experience. I wanted to see whether my 4090 would fit in this case in this format, and obviously it won't. With that push-pull logic that I've used, there's not enough space. Also with the tubes at the bottom, there's not enough space. So this is a problem. If you top mount the radiator, you won't have this issue because the tubes won't be there. And also if I flip the radiator around so the tubes were at the top of the rad, then I wouldn't have that issue, though then I'd have that fighting with the fans on top. So it's really important to sort of plan out the logic of your build before you do it so you don't have issues like this. I'm not that pleased with the aesthetic look of how these tubes sit going across the GPU like this, although they aren't touching, it's worth noting, so they don't actually touch the GPU, which is pretty good. So that's the basic setup. Then you've got NZXT's Cam software. So make sure this is one of the first things you download once you've installed your all-in-one cooler, and then you go in there and click on settings and turn on dark mode because it's better and everybody loves dark mode. And then you can see that you have PC monitoring, you've got system specs, and then you've got the lighting. Now I'll show some of the lighting effects in a minute, but if you've got everything set up properly, you should see all the different RGB controllers in here with the different fans connected to it. And then when you change between those lighting effects, you'll see that they change through every fan. So you can see that you can do it individually for each of the fans, and you can also tweak those settings, but you can also adjust the brightness overall from this top dial, so you can choose what the brightness is throughout the whole system, and you can adjust things nicely there. If you scroll down to the Kraken Elite display, you can also adjust all sorts of things. You'll see there's integration for Spotify, for Google Photos, so you can have your own photos displaying on there, and more. You also have a dual infographic setup, which is one of my favorites and always has been with the Kraken series, is you can have it display your CPU and GPU temperatures so you can see them at a glance. You can also customize things. So for example, you can make the logo black if you have a black background so you can't see it if you don't want to see the NZXT logo. And I personally like to customize the colors so I can see it at a glance as well. Intel's blue, obviously, and NVIDIA's green. So it's nice to be able to see those and then, know what temperature what's at just based on colors without even seeing the labeling. You also now have on the Elite version dual infographic plus GIF, so you can browse Giphy, find what GIFs you want, and then apply them. You saw keyboard cat applied earlier on at the beginning, for example, so you can see that again now. One problem when you do this is you can't then get rid of the NZXT logo, so that's always there because you can't change the color on it, but you can customize that in loads of different ways and make it pretty snazzy. You also have a carousel option, which allows you to basically select from a variety of the different options in there, and then it will change between them. You can see as default, it's every 5 seconds it will go through. Quick note, you'll also notice that there is a button to rotate display. So if you've installed your pump with the tubes on the right-hand side, for example, in a slightly different position, you can just click that rotate display button and it'll change the position of the display. So that makes life a little bit easier. There are loads of different options in terms of what you can do with this. One of them is, for example, this audio visualization one, which reacts to the sounds that are playing on your PC. So there's loads of customization that you can do in there. Now in the cooling section, you'll see you can adjust both the pump speed and the fan speed. You can set up custom curves so you can adjust when the fans ramp up and sort of the speeds that they go to. And you can configure it based on the temperature of the liquid in the system. You can also just choose from silent, fixed performance modes or custom for each of those, and you can do it for the pump as well. Now you'll see you also have the current temperatures of that system in there at a glance, but you can also get that in the PC monitoring section, and Cam also has an overlay that you can activate if you want to. Now I want to show some of the different colors in there. So obviously you can change in a variety of different colors. These fans actually have some good lighting because you can see it even though they're set in intake mode. So you see in the back of the fans, you can still see some nice RGB lighting from it. Obviously, this is all from that syncing as well. So in the Cam software, it's all connected up. When you change between those various different lighting modes, you'll see it all changes. The front fans, the top fans, everything. And then obviously you can also get those GIFs going and have the different displays and there. So here you can see a nice view of this. Now, as I said, you can mount it with the tubes in different positions depending on your build as well. You just need to bear in mind that obviously the breakout cable is going to come out at some point as well, but you can position it in different places. I'm not happy with how this is finished up though, so I probably wouldn't have mounted it this way around, but I wanted to demonstrate various different things, how you could do push-pull the logic of it and the things to think about. Because obviously, if I'd got my 4090 graphics card and was trying to put it in here, I wouldn't have been able to fit it in. But the Kraken cooler is a fantastic bit of kit. Loads of different display options. The fans look really nice. The setup's been hopefully pretty interesting and straightforward for you. Let me know in the comments if you've got any questions. Subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks for watching.
You've made it right to the end of the video, you brilliant legend you. If you've enjoyed it, click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and drop me a comment down below if you've got any questions. If you really enjoyed it, consider joining the channel and see the benefits of doing so. Check out these other videos. You might well find them interesting or useful. And most importantly, have a great life.